Chinese tanks in World of Tanks are often viewed as some of the budget Soviet one, and in today's video we're going to flip that round and see why some of the Soviet tanks are just a knockoff of some of the Chinese ones. And what better way to have a look at these vehicles is to check out the medium tanks, and we're starting off with the 121B and we'll lead on to the 121. And there's something really important that I want to showcase throughout this gameplay, is that not only will we see what the tank's capabilities are and how Chinese tanks can still be very competitive within the game, but we're also going to see how you can play these heavily armoured medium tanks that are kind of completely different from your traditional British medium tanks and American medium tanks that rely on that high DPM and have that kind of relatively high alpha, whereas the 121B has kind of that armor model but also a bit more of something else when it comes to being able to deal with some of the opponents in the game, and hopefully it's going to be an interesting one. So the first game kicks off with us looking at, of course, one of our favourite maps, Redshire. And Redshire, very good for this style of medium, where you can basically side scrape using that side armour of the 121B, angling and really showing minimal amounts of your tank and using the accuracy of the medium tanks and the 121B to duke it out with some of the heavy tanks like this AMX M4. And so far you've seen that the armour model has racked up 1440 block damage, which is something that you typically don't see with some of the other vehicles, like for example the Centurion Action X, like for example the American mediums, the Patton, etc. You just don't quite see that with those vehicles, but this one definitely has that ability and is a very brawling medium, which makes it super fun to see. And you can see here able to deal with things like the Maus bouncing rounds, angling the armour up as he goes up the slope to avoid taking the shell. Unfortunately takes one from the AMX M4 54, but at the end of the day you can only bounce so many rounds within World of Tanks before RNG comes and whips away some of that hit points. But really good play here. I mean, superb trades, exactly what you want to be doing, pulling around those corners, making sure that you hug this corner really tight, because if you start overexposing your vehicle and overexposing the lower plate of this thing, and especially against something like the Maus, who is above you, they can shoot down onto that lower plate and really start being a pest. Now the Maus obviously pushes way too far around that corner, and unfortunately for him is going to end up back in the garage where he belongs. And so a really nice start to the game. Unfortunately loses a little bit more hit points to that AMX M4, and of course the Maus are both penned at the same time, but really good use of this armour, side scraping, and it's a tank that actually works. A lot of the Soviet tanks that you see don't typically bounce anywhere near as much as this sort of vehicle. I mean, I'm looking at the 140 and the T62A, but good thing about this is I guess it's more comparable to that of the 430U, even if the 430U does have that increased alpha that this just doesn't quite get. Now this tank, just as a little caveat, has 390 alpha, similar to a lot of the other tier 10 mediums, but of course it is quite lackluster in the damage per minute mark, and so you've only got 3000 DPM base. That is, of course, you can get it up to about 3500 depending on how you're setting up your vehicle. If you're using vents, if you're using rammer, etc., you can get it lower and lower your reload. So it's still very good. I mean, it's capable of really rinsing through a lot of the opponents, and you have some fairly decent kind of armour to contend with a lot of the tanks that you come up against. So even if you don't have the highest DPM, you can at least bounce a few rounds and you can trade more effectively with this, which makes it one of the best medium tanks, at least at this tier, and is very powerful in the right hands, as you're seeing here. And the more and more you get used to playing these Chinese tanks, you'll start realizing just how good they really are. And I think a lot of people gloss over them and don't really realize how good they are, and that's really something that they should learn. Now unfortunately, bit of a mistake there to actually give the frontal plate of this tank to the T30, who's able to easily go through the upper plate of this vehicle, of course, especially if the T30 was loading a PCR. Unfortunately, well, fortunately he wasn't, but still able to go straight through the upper plate. Of course, I believe the T30 has 286 pen on its standard rounds with the 15, so yeah, it's quite easy to go through. But is seeing here taking advantage of the T-30's long reload and basically punishing him. Now unfortunately our T-30 doesn't manage to finish him off, but it doesn't matter because he's quickly sent back to the garage. And there you've seen an outstanding result in such a competitive tank, and I feel like a lot of people just do not understand how to play these Chinese tanks. They are not your typical kind of just sitting at the back sniping and using the gun to just basically farm up opponents from long range. They can still do it, I mean you're seeing it here, but they definitely are not for that sort of playstyle. They're for the playstyle where you're getting up close and personal and using them as those brawling vehicles, which is what makes them so fun to play and why they offer something a little different to your traditional medium at this tier. So hopefully that's given a little overview. Of course, if you have any thoughts on the 121B and if you think that these Chinese tanks are just trash, let me know in the comment section down below. I very much find these to be super fun to play and of course offering something different. Especially when you look at things like the 121, which we'll have a look at in a sec. But if you are enjoying these content, please do think about subscribing, as it massively helps out, and I can guarantee that I'll give you a free ammo rack in the next game that you're playing. I'm guaranteeing it, I promise. Anyway, moving forward, apologies. At 9,500 damage done with 6,000 block damage, so this is the potential that they do have. Am I going to say that they're going to be able to block this damage reliably every single game? Absolutely not, and it depends on how you're using the armour of the vehicle, if you're side scraping, etc. So just take that with a pinch of salt. The armour still does work though. But you're seeing here, just trying to mop up the rest of the damage. Redshire on your encounter battle, not particularly the most kind of riveting gameplay, I guess. It's a lot of corner fighting, and that is what this tank does well. But when you do get through this push through stage where you can push towards the opponents, things like this Projecto 65 here, yeah, you can definitely be very competitive. Now unfortunately for the VZ55, he's not capable of bouncing any rounds from this tank, given the fact that the APCR rounds is standard of 261 pen and the heat rounds have 350 pen. So penetration, not really a problem with this, and that's why it's able to really punish those opponents. And with the HE rounds, even more damage potential with it, with 105 pen and 480 alpha. High rolling the enemy artillery to end up the game with 11,000 damage. So let's jump into the next vehicle, and what a brilliant result that was. And so what about this vehicle, the Tetri one, the 121, not the B, but the A version, or at least the higher alpha damage version of the Chinese mediums. And this is of course the top tier medium in the Tetri, the 121, and the 121 offers something a little bit different to what you'd expect from the 121B, in the fact that this has 440 alpha and has some slightly different statistics because of that fact, and we'll get into those as we go through the gameplay. But once again, this is going to showcase some spots that you can use on steps in your own gameplay and how you can use that to your advantage and hopefully come out with some brilliant results in these more heavily armoured mediums that don't have that really amazing flexibility that some of the kind of British mediums have, that give you the opportunity to use gun depression and that sort of stuff. Now straight away he comes to the corner on steps, but notices straight away that the enemy team are pushing quite aggressively, and so if he stays in that spot you often find yourself getting overwhelmed, and people on the enemy team, even if it's not worth it for them, will push round the corner, and that can be a real big problem. So instead he does decide to pull back to this position here, which allows him to get some free shells into the opponents as they come around to try and YOLO the M6Y. Now this is a good play, and you can do it in your own gameplays, as well as giving you the opportunity to retreat back around and avoid taking any damage. And that is super crucial when you are playing in these sorts of vehicles, because you want to make sure that you can be somewhat aggressive, as you saw from the first game, making sure that you're up close and personal and can keep on reloading, whilst also being able to find yourself in a situation that is preferable for your tank and you're not just getting YOLO'd by the entire enemy team, as I'm sure you're well aware that that doesn't typically end well, and you end up with a sausage sandwich of just being sliced and diced from all sorts of directions, and you're very quickly sent back to the garage. Now unfortunately is tracked by the Projecto 65 with a nice little blind fire by the looks of it, doesn't realise that he ended up tracking him, and in fact he gets away quite easily there from the enemy team. Now it looks like they're going to spot him there, which they exactly do, as you'd expect, but now he's in the cover and he's able to hopefully get a nicely aimed shell there, and unfortunately the Mouse actually snipes the cupola of the 121, which is kind of one of the weak points of this tank. And of course people aim for those cupolas. Of course most of the Soviet vehicles don't really have cupolas, so I guess that's one weak point of the Chinese vehicles, is that these cupolas seem to be a lot more prominent, and especially on this tank. But regardless of that, the Maus and the enemy team are starting to push forward, but because of the fact that he's pulled right back behind this ridge line, which is a fantastic spot for you to essentially hold back these opponents that do come and YOLO across this area, you can essentially get hold down here, and it is difficult for the enemy team to reliably pen you from this distance, and that is the armor model holding up. The turret armor working a lot better than you'd see from a lot of other mediums, especially if you were looking at the French mediums, for example, and this is why he's been able to just basically plow rounds through these opponents, and they're not really having any impact against him, and it's a pretty safe position at this moment in time. The only thing that you have to be very careful about is tanks that move up to where this AE phase 1 is, because they can get side shots into you, because the cover that is over here and where you can get gun depression onto the vehicles is kind of, there isn't any, so you can get hit quite easily. The Type 5 manages to land an AP round and actually pens as well, so kind of getting unlucky with the rounds that have been coming in here, but nonetheless just trying to plow a few rounds and more into the opponents. And the problem that you'll find with the Chinese tanks is, as soon as you do expose the hull armor of these vehicles, they really do become a little bit lackluster, and especially if you can't side scrape or you're in this sort of position where you are forced to stay in this area, and especially if you're coming up against tanks that actually have gun depression and have turret armor like the 80 phase 1 partially does, but of course him getting over here can be a bit of a pain, because he can use the ridge line, get a hold down, and make it difficult for him to reliably trade, and of course he's going to land a single shot every single time. But good position at this point in the game, and unfortunately can't retreat any further. Maybe he should have done it earlier, but at the end of the day he's been able to really stop the enemy team from making that advancement, so it's been really beneficial for his team to have for him to be in this position. But the game is definitely not over, and we're going to see a whole lot more from our player here as he's moving through. The great thing about these tanks is, like we said, has the higher alpha, but that allows you to trade with some of the heavy tanks a lot easier, and if you do get hold down like you see in here, you can essentially trade quite easily, and you can end up actually bouncing a lot of rounds and end up with that block damage like we saw with the 121B. They're very similar in how they play, of course this one just having more alpha and less DPM, sacrificing about 150 DPM roughly over the 121B, and having a 9-second reload compared to that of the 121B, which has approximately a 7.5 to 8-second reload roughly, and that means that you can certainly do a little bit better with this tank in terms of not having to fire as many shells, and you can be in a bit of a better place when it comes to kind of coming away with more damage, and you don't sacrifice that DPM too much in every engagement that you're going to be making. So that's one of the benefits of playing this, and I feel like a lot of people see these tanks and like I said in the first replay, they just assume that this tank is going to be bad, or that it doesn't get enough of the kind of gun handling to be able to do what it needs to do. But actually, with the tank being quite an aggressive tank, and how it should be played being kind of a forward force in the games, the gun handling is actually pretty okay. I mean, it's nothing outrageous, it's no kind of Gorilla 15, even though that tank actually is one of those lies. And you can actually see a video on the Gorilla 15 that we did on the channel, and maybe I'll link it at the end of this one, as that's definitely the most accurate lie that Wargame have ever told. But anyway, this game and this tank has 5 degrees of gun depression, and so he, instead of staying in that position where he was, is going to move over to here, which is hopefully where he's going to be able to deal with some of the enemy tanks that are going to be on the flat ground, or at least above him, in which he's going to be able to utilize that 5 degrees of gun depression and not have to be reliant on using the hill areas, and hopefully he can come away with a win. Now, Pushing a T124 is never fun, especially if it's sat down in a hold down location. Now luckily he doesn't manage to find him in a hold down location, but instead on top of the hill. So he plows around into the side of the turret, exactly what you want to see, and instead of pushing directly at him, knowing that the enemy team are kind of over on this side and with no team support, he's going to take the smart route, and instead of trying to push into an immovable force and a camping force, he's going to actually pull back and regroup with some of the teammates, or at least put himself in a better position such that hopefully his team are going to move up and get into a better position. Like this E75 going through the middle, probably not the best idea when there's an FE4005 in the base, but at least it's going to be able to give a different angle and get that crossfire going, which is what you always want to do. And luckily the mobility of this tank being very good for a medium tank, you've got 55 or 56 kilometers an hour, just that 1 extra kilometer an hour over the 121B, and that allows you to relocate quite nicely. It's nothing like a super slow medium tank or anything like that. And maybe you'd want to use turbo, I don't know. It really depends on your playstyle, if you want to get into position or if you want the advantages that things like the rammer and of course using any of the additional equipment that you can have, enhanced equipment. And it really depends on whether you have those as to how good these tanks can get, because these tanks do rely on you actually having the bond equipment, or at least improved equipment, as opposed to the standard equipment, because the aim time and accuracy can be a little bit trollish, I'm not going to lie, when you do have them stock or at least using just standard equipment. So these are tanks that are generally better off using the bond equipment, unfortunately, or at least some of the other equipment that you might have available to you, bounty, etc. But either way, he's now repositioned himself in such a way that he's able to provide vision into the center and also the left hand side of the map. Has to be a little bit careful that the T124 doesn't crop up in this location and manage to get a free side shot into him, because he can't pull back quick enough to get down to here to avoid being shot. So he doesn't want to stay here too long, to the point where the E4 could have actually come up from here, or maybe even the Progetto. But luckily for him, the Progetto, the T124 and of course the FE4005 are still in their base, and he manages to shut down the enemy medium, making it a whole lot easier to outspot these opponents, hopefully, when he pushes in, or at least get a free shot of damage on them as they're kind of moving forward. Now he does manage to, out of render range, hit the E4. Lovely work there. Easy way to improve your damage in your games is you never actually deal any damage if you don't take the shot. So he does take the shot. It's at no disadvantage to him to have done that, and he's actually come out with a little bit more damage, and that picks up 8,100 damage so far. And the game is by far not over. There's still 2,700 hit points left on the enemy team, even if there is an FE4005 that can hammer at your teammate in the 777-2, unfortunately, which sucks, but it is the case, and that leaves it into a bit of a stalemate now, with just him and the Foch 155 being on a decent chunk of hit points, but him being a one-shot to a lot of opponents makes this a bit of a difficult carry if you are being aggressive. So instead pulls back behind the bush, exactly what you want to be doing, making sure that you do put some obstacles between you and as many opponents as you possibly can. He finds the FE4005 and decides to make his move, plants one into the side of the FV, manages to actually low roll that shell, having 530 average damage on the HE, and then low rolls the second shell. Yay! Typical Wargaming RNG coming in when you need it, and of course ending up being at the roulette wheel of Wargaming is never a good idea. But you can see here he remains undetected and ends up ploughing that round into the 704, getting detected after he fires, but still looking pretty decent. Foch 155 on a little bit of a decent chunk of hit points, but he needs to make sure that this FE4005 doesn't surprise him by pulling up from some random location and putting one into him. Now the FE actually pulls out and shoots the Foch 155 in the side, which is gutting, because now it is a bit of a Todger twister, if you know what I mean. It's definitely a bit of a butt twitcher as well. So he's going to be moving forward and coming into this location, because the enemy team are expecting him to be over here. You're going to expect that the enemy team are going to come into this location to try and get a shot into the side of him or look in the other way, and they definitely weren't expecting him to be here. And this is exactly what you want to be trying to do and replicating in your own games when you are in tanks like this, where you don't have the best DPM, where you can just sit there, take a shell and deal with the damage. And you definitely can't take any shells with this one, but with only 50 seconds left on the clock, it's not looking good, because he's going to have to go in at some point if he wants to win this game, because a draw is essentially just a loss in my eyes. And so instead decides that he's going to come up into this location. The E4 tries to make a way in up through the slope, and the FV is also moving in, but can he get the gun depression? He can, and the FV is also sent back to the garage. And this was yet again another showcase of Chinese superiority within World of Tanks, even if some Chinese tanks aren't necessarily as good as they have been in the past, or at least some of them aren't necessarily ever been good. But these two medium tanks are very, very good, and hopefully you did enjoy. And make sure that if you did, please do hit that like button and check out some of the other content on screen right now, which showcase a little bit of something extra, and hopefully you can learn a thing or two in those gameplay too. But other than that, I hope you have a fantastic rest of the day, and don't forget to subscribe for that extra ammo rack in your next game.